For the first time this offseason, Mike Macdonald has made a commitment to his starting quarterback, but just how long of a leash will he have in 2024? We're going to be breaking it all down in a special Saturday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined here on this special Saturday edition of Locked On Seahawks by my co-host, Nick Lee. And special thanks to all the 12s out there, whether you're listening in Tacoma, Washington, or in Indianapolis, Indiana, where I'm getting ready to watch the next round of the NCAA tournament. We greatly appreciate each and every one of you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We didn't get a Blue Friday show in because, again, I was watching college basketball yesterday. I'll admit, I decided to take the day off. So we're going to dive into Seahawks content with some March Madness flavor today. Our first ever Seahawks alumni March Madness bracket. That is going to be an absolute blast as we dive into those matchups. This episode is brought your way by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Now for your lead story here on our Saturday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Since he was hired as the replacement for Pete Carroll, Mike Macdonald has had several opportunities to confirm or stand behind his starting quarterback who was going to start in 2024. He had not until today been willing to commit to Geno Smith as the starter in 2024, but that has changed according to comments from Tom Pelissero on NFL media. Mike Macdonald finally committed to Geno Smith as his starter in 2024, saying, I've talked to Geno about it, very confident in Geno. Geno's going to be our starter. Sam Howell knows he's going to be our backup, but Sam is a great young player, and he's got a really bright future that we believe in. So this is kind of a twofold comment when you're looking at what Mike Macdonald said. He's still using some coach speak in this. There is a commitment, Nick. Clearly, he is saying Geno's a starter. John Schneider confirmed this a few weeks ago, but now we've had both of them say it, and yet there's always that but at the end of this in the case of Sam Howell. We traded for this guy because we think he's got a very bright future. So I think this now creates the next question. Just how long is that leash going to be for Geno Smith as a starter in 2024 now that Sam Howell is in town?
I can already see the the Homer Simpson meme of the Drew Lock fans backing into the bushes and coming out as Sam Howell in a Sam Howell jersey. Yeah, honestly, anyone who thought that Sam Howell was going to waltz in here and be on equal footing with Geno Smith going into 2024 was living in Candy Fairyland. That just wasn't happening. I mean, Howell was about to be benched for whoever they were going to be drafting number 2 in Washington. He hasn't earned that right. And, when we look at the stats last year, Geno had a 59.5 QBR. Howell had 42.4. Geno with a 92.1 passer rating. Howell at 78.9. Completion percentage, yards per attempt, you name it. Geno Smith had the edge there. So Geno Smith absolutely should be the starter. Let's start there. And I think it's going to be much like, in years past with Drew Lock, a little bit different because now I can envision a future where Geno Smith has a fairly solid year in 2024. Yet, fast forward a year or two, and Sam Howell is still the starting quarterback for the Seahawks. That wasn't maybe quite the case in the Drew Lock scenario. I think it's a fairly long leash, and I also predict that it's going to be a lot longer than some people want, especially those who are already in the anti-Geno camp, unfortunately. Those voices are going to get loud the second Geno starts to slip up this year, unfortunately. And now, this is a bit more of a darker cloud kind of lingering over that because Sam Howell does kind of have that future that maybe Drew Lock didn't quite have in that same sense. So I would say if I had to put like a number on it, I would say at least half the year is probably too aggressive. I'd say at least 2/3 of the season. And it straight up would not surprise me, Corbin, if they give Geno the full year, unless he completely bottoms out. I really do think this will be a fairly long leash.
This is going to surprise some of our listeners because of many of the comments that I have made on this show leading up to this. And I haven't changed my opinion on Geno Smith as a quarterback. I still think that he, when he's playing his best, can be a top 10 quarterback in the NFL. The stats bear it out. The film bears it out. But this is just a different situation than what he has had the last couple of years. His biggest advocate is no longer in the coaching staff, and that's Pete Carroll. And the fact that Mike Macdonald, we talked with David Harrison of Locked On Commanders about this after the trade went down. There was an opportunity for Mike Macdonald to coach in practices against Sam Howell last year. The Commanders and Ravens did joint practices. So he got to see him on the practice field, and Howell had a really good few days there going against that eventual number one defense for the Ravens. He is very high on this kid. There was clearly involvement from Mike Macdonald in this process. I want to go get this kid because he has seen what he can do against his defense, and he's got a lot of confidence in him. He made that clear in that comment to Tom Pelissero today that, yeah, Geno's our starter, but we think there's a very bright future for this kid. So this is what I'm going to say. I think Geno Smith, if I had to make a prediction right now, unless there's an injury, I expect he's going to be the starter in 2024 for the entire season. But I do think that leash is shorter than it was with Drew Lock, because you've got a coach now that just handpicked a quarterback there. There's no question about it that Mike Macdonald was involved in that process. He handpicked Sam Howell to go with John Schneider's viewpoint. Schneider's loved him since he was coming out of North Carolina, and they just didn't make that draft pick because they viewed Drew Lock at that time as kind of a pseudo draft pick. There's a lot of different reasons to believe that this situation is different for Geno Smith. I think that the Seahawks are confident in him. They've expressed that. But I think at the same time, there is a shorter leash here, and Sam Howell is going to be coming to compete. Whether they're going to be letting him compete for a starting job doesn't sound like that's at all the case. But this kid is going to come in, and he is going to be ready to be nipping at Geno Smith's heels. There's no question about it. So I don't think that he is the starter this year. At the same time, as you mentioned, if there is a slip up, and if Sam Howell has a really strong training camp preseason with this football team, he's 23. I could very easily see John Schneider without Pete Carroll being there. I could see him say, hey, we're going to move forward now with this young quarterback that we think is our future. So I'm not going to say there's a strong possibility that he is going to be a starter at any point this year without an injury. At the same time, I feel like the leash is shorter than it was with Drew Lock.
Yeah, that's you bring up a good point with him, whose guy is in the room with Sam Howell definitely being handpicked. And I do think it's going to be shorter than it was with Drew Lock. This was just me thinking that the leash was really long with Drew Lock in there too. And I do think it does get shorter with Sam Howell because I didn't really think that even, in a scenario where, Geno Smith has a year or two really solid, and I didn't really see a scenario where Drew Lock then, inherits the throne, so to speak. I didn't really see that. Didn't quite fit. This fits where Geno does. He has a decent year and they still move to Sam Howell. I could see a scenario where he does struggle for, I think 2/3 of the year. I think that'd be where I'd put the sweet spot for, if the Seahawks are sitting there, I don't know what 2/3 of 17 is off the top of my head, but, maybe 5 and 7, lackluster offense. I could definitely see them saying that crowd, the Sam Howell crowd will get extremely loud. And I could definitely see a situation where, it's kind of floundering. We need a spark, that whole coach speak. We need a spark, and throwing Sam Howell in there about that time. I don't know what time of year that would be. I don't know, just past Thanksgiving or something like that. But I do see Geno Smith getting a leash, definitely shorter than it was with Drew Lock. But it's going to be one of the more fascinating storylines, especially as the season starts with Geno as a starter, and especially when that game comes, that Geno Smith, unfortunate, below average game, when that comes, how this coaching staff will react.
Yeah, I think there's a couple other things that we have to consider here too. When the Seahawks got Drew Lock, he had 1 year left in his contract. Sam Howell's got 2. So you have 2 full years there for evaluation where you don't have to worry about giving him a raise. He's going to have barely over $1 million cap hit. And also, quite frankly, this is just my opinion. There's going to be fans that disagree, and that's fine. I think Sam Howell, what he did in Washington last year, vastly exceeded what Drew Lock did in Denver. He threw for almost 4,000 passing yards. Yes, he led the league in interceptions, but part of that was because he threw the ball more than any quarterback in the NFL. There's already that tangible experience and production on the field that you didn't see as consistently from Drew Lock in Denver. I just think there's a lot of things at play here that are working in Howell's favor more than it was for Drew Lock when he came over, and just the fact that he's 2 years younger than Lock was when he came over. So I just think there's a lot of different elements at play here. That being said, this is Geno's job, and if he plays really well, you don't have to worry about Sam Howell. You've got a guy that's your starter, but if there's some slip-ups, if he had some rough starts like he did last year early in the season, I wouldn't be shocked if John Schneider and Mike Macdonald said, you know what? We might not be competing for a Super Bowl this year. Let's just throw Sam Howell in there and see what happens. So I do think the leash is a little shorter. When we come back, it is March Madness season. There are games going on as we speak right now, and we're going to take a Seahawks March Madness perspective a little differently this year than we've done in the past with our Seahawks Alumni March Madness tournament. We're going to be looking at some of the best players in Seahawks history that came from certain schools. We're going to seed the teams that have the most talent in Seahawks history, and we're going to have them go up against each other with fan output to see who advances to the round of 16. We're going to start in the East region. That'll be coming up next year on our special Saturday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by FanDuel. Say goodbye to busted brackets because FanDuel lets you bet on every game of the tourney with March Madness officially underway. Whether you're betting on a big upset like a 14 advancing to the Sweet 16 or a 1 seed winning it all, it's time to go dancing on America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 to use on point spreads, money lines. You can even pick who's going to win it all. Whether you think it's going to be a blue blood like Duke or North Carolina, or a Cinderella like NC State who just advanced to the Sweet 16, all options are on the table at your fingertips. Just visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn and bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets. You're listening to a special Saturday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined here on a weekend show by my co-host, Nick Lee, and a special thanks to all the 12s. As always, thank you for tuning in and making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. For those of you in the comments section here on the live show that were letting us know we are starting a little late, you can blame Oakland and North Carolina State for that because they went to overtime, and we are basketball nerds, so we were watching the conclusion of that game that NC State ended up winning. And by the way, I really want to see their center, DJ Burns. I want the Seahawks to sign him as a tackle prospect. I want to see him play offensive line and protect Sam Howell or Geno Smith in the future. Anyway, I digress. We are doing a March Madness theme activity here. We've had input from the 12s as well. And Nick, we're going to be doing an alumni March Madness tournament, 32 college programs with players that played at those programs and starred for the Seahawks. And we're going to figure out who has the best alumni for the Seahawks. And so let's get started in the East region. This is an exciting matchup, Nick. #1 seed Miami, led by Hall of Famer Cortez Kennedy and Brian Blades, against 16 seed Ole Miss with DK Metcalf and a really underrated corner in Seahawks history, Ken Lucas. This does feel to me like this is a pretty lopsided matchup.
Yeah, this might be a little Purdue grambling going on here. Obviously, Cortez Kennedy, one of the greatest Seahawks of all time. He's at least in easily top 5, probably higher than that in Seahawks history. Probably, number 2, number 1. Whatever your flavor is. Brian Blades, I think the depth, you see this all the time in the NCAA tournament where, there's an upstart, young team that's thinking they're going to be Cinderella with a great star player like DK Metcalf. They just don't have the depth. And with Miami, with, Cortez Kennedy and Brian Blades on down the list, Darrell Williams, that's a pretty darn deep team, if not maybe the deepest we have.
Well, if you look at the way that fans voted on this, fans voted almost 88% on this one for Miami. And no offense to DK Metcalf, great player, but Cortez Kennedy, Brian Blades, Jimmy Graham, 3 years with the Seahawks. And I know some fans think it was a bad 3 years, but he still made 2 Pro Bowls. Like, this is a very lopsided matchup. Miami, you're moving on. We're not going to see a Fairleigh Dickinson over Purdue in this one. With our 8-9 matchup, we got a couple blue bloods here. LSU and Notre Dame both having 4 notable alumni. This really is the battle of the beef against the battle of the athletes, Nick. You've got Kevin White, Damian Lewis, and Al Woods, Jamal Adams on this list as well, going up against Ricky Waters, Golden Tate, John Carlson, and Steve Nyhouse. This is a really interesting 8-9 matchup that could go down to the wire.
Yeah, this could be one of those overtime games that we just got treated to. Man, that's a really good one. I'm going to probably go with the 9 seed. And I think I saw somewhere, Corbin, that in March Madness, does the 9 seed have like a slight, like 50.8% advantage over 8 seeds or some weird thing like that? I think the 9 seeds in a weird way have had a lot of success. And I think this might be one of those times again where they're maybe slightly deeper and maybe have that extra playmaker on the top.
Yeah, and this one's gone down to the wire. The voting wrapping up with Notre Dame getting 57.7% of the vote, LSU 42%. Personally, Nick, this is who I'd vote for because I think Ricky Waters is a Hall of Fame player. There's questions about his character. I think that's really what's kept him out of Canton, but he was a phenomenal player, gave the Seahawks a lot of fun contributions. Golden Tate was a really good player for them. I think John Carlson would have had a much better career without injuries that shortened it. So this one's really one of those true 8-9, anything could go matchups. But Notre Dame advancing to play Miami in the next round. For our Husky fans out there, we've got number 5 seed Washington going up against number 12 Florida. And I am going to shock some fans here, but if I was voting on this, I actually think that this is a 12-5 matchup where the 12 has a real good chance, even though they only have 2 players on this list. I think Darrell Jackson and John L. Williams, from a Seahawks perspective, had more of an impact overall than the cast of characters on the Washington side. Warren Moon only played 2 years in Seattle. Blair Bush was a solid starting center. Jeremy Stevens, let's not even go there. Paul Scansey was a solid complimentary receiver, but it feels like there's more star power actually on Florida's smaller roster here. Yeah,
this is another one where for me, it's like the James Madison, Wisconsin thing. It could be that's what you're going for. But for me, it's Florida has that one good player, or 2 top, maybe a high-low kind of guy. Washington for me, Warren Moon, Hall of Fame quarterback, obviously. Now, if you take strictly what he did with the Seahawks, maybe, and then Jermaine Kearse, he would have one of the greatest catches in Super Bowl history, and it should still be. And man, that still bothers me because that whole moment was obviously ruined moments later. But I'm going to go Washington. I'm going to pan to the home fans, and I think they have a deeper roster. And I think Jermaine Kearse is continually slept on as one of the better receivers the Seahawks have had in the last 20 years.
I think the referees were paid off for this one because our fans have Washington at 81%. I feel like Florida would give them a better fight than that, but Washington is moving on.
Advantage.
Surprise. This next one I think is going to be a close one between 2 far different seeds too. We've got NC State, the 4th seed, against Oklahoma State, the 13th seed. Now, Russell Wilson obviously gives NC State immense star power in Seahawks history. Corn Robinson dropped a lot of passes. J.R. Sweezy was a solid starter. Stephen Hauschka, one of the better kickers in franchise history. Sean Locklear, I think, got a bad rap, was a pretty solid lineman for a number of years. But Chris Carson and Russell Okung were key members of this recent iteration of Seahawks. And Carson, a couple 1,000-yard seasons. Russell Okung, if he could stayed healthy, had some really good years, helped the Seahawks win a Super Bowl. This is kind of one of those 4-13 matchups that you look at and think, there's a chance there could be an upset. That being said, I think Russell Wilson carries NC State here at the quarterback position.
Yeah, maybe they're tied at halftime, and then NC State goes on like a 20-2 run in the second half or something like that. So
it's like the Western Kentucky Marquette.
Exactly, yeah. So Russell Wilson, obviously franchise leader and everything quarterback, franchise leader in approximate value by Pro Football Reference. He's the Naismith, player of the year kind of candidate if you want to go basketball there. He carries the weight big time, and I'm going to go NC State.
Yeah, our fans agree. 80% picking NC State. This is one of those games, maybe it does stay kind of close, but I actually could see this being a 4-13 blowout, in my opinion. So, Oklahoma State's got some good players Seahawks have had, but NC State feels like they could be a sleeper to go deep in this tournament. Our next matchup, another Washington State school. Washington State against USC, 6-13 or 6-11. I'm going to say that this is another one that has upset potential because if you're looking at the overall impact, Malcolm Smith was a Super Bowl MVP, Lofa Tatupu, several-time All-Pro selection. It just feels like there's more star power for USC than Washington State. This could be one of those matchups where the stars carry the lower seed to a victory.
Yeah, I'm going to go, USC is Duquesne and Washington State is BYU in this scenario. Here's my first real big upset. Lofa Tatupu, Malcolm Smith, 2 significant linebackers in Seahawks history for various reasons. Yeah, Tutupu obviously better overall resume as far as, throughout the years, all pro in 2007, 3 straight Pro Bowls. Yeah. Malcolm Smith, obviously self-explanatory. So yeah, this is going to be a Duquesne 11 seed win here.
Well, our listeners don't agree. No surprise here. Washington schools getting the
home court advantage
bias here. Washington State does have Marcus Trufant and some other good players on their list. So Washington State at 65.5% is going on to the next round. This is a matchup that I think would be pretty one-sided coming up. Number 3, Stanford against number 14, Arizona State. John Harris was an underrated player. Paul Moyer did some good things. Zach Miller was a key member of the Super Bowl teams, but come on, Doug Baldwin, and Richard Sherman, the star power those two present. And Dave Wyman was a very solid linebacker that now obviously covers the team. This just feels like a matchup where not only does Stanford have the star power, but just the overall ability, I think here, this would be a game where Stanford would pull away pretty early and then end up blowing out Arizona State.
Yeah, Zach Miller gets a few points for being really nice to me and my family in line at Disneyland a while back. That's about it for me. That was the year after they won the Super Bowl, actually. But yeah, this is pretty darn easy for me. Richard Sherman and Doug Baldwin, too. At least one of them should be at least a Seahawks Ring of Honor member, maybe both. Wyman, obviously, too. In this discussion, still in the environment of Seahawks. So yeah, this is a pretty healthy 25-point kind of victory.
This is the most lopsided poll that we've had to this point. Stanford with 97.3% of the vote. And as you and I just talked, it just doesn't seem like this is a fair matchup. Stanford is
already underseeded them, I think.
Players. Our next one, this is one I'm excited about, being a running back guy. And Dave Wyman is not supposed to be on the graphic. Those of you watching on YouTube, I was watching Oakland and North Carolina State. He went to Stanford. But Alabama's got Sean Alexander and Jaron Reed going up against Michigan State. Ken Walker III, Julian Peterson, and Daryl the Burner Turner. This really feels like one of those 7-10 matchups that could go either way because there's a lot of really fun former Seahawks and current Seahawks on this matchup.
Yeah, the top two for Alabama, Sean Alexander, one of the better Seahawks of all time, and still the franchise leader in rushing. Jaron Reed, who's had a nice, I think that second. Here's what I'm gonna say: that second kind of resurgence with the Seahawks with Jaron Reed, I feel like has pushed Bama over the top there with a solid, 5-point kind of victory. Those two, maybe a high-low combo, have turned into a pretty solid tandem for Bama.
I think if we did this matchup a few years from now, maybe we have different opinions of this. I just think, Sean Alexander is one of the best players in franchise history, and Jaron Reed's been a really good second-round pick. Maybe Ken Walker III ends up being one of the most iconic running backs in franchise history when he's done. But this just feels like it's good players against an elite one and a really good one. So I'm going with Alabama on this one. And our fans agree, 69%. Our last matchup in the East region, number 2 Michigan against number 15 West Virginia. Geno Smith says, not only am I the starter, I'm going to pull a huge upset here with Bruce Irvin going up against Steve Hutchinson, Dave Brown, and Frank Clark. I like West Virginia as a 15 seed here. I think it could be a pretty fun matchup for a half, but you're talking about a Hall of Famer and Steve Hutchinson, a guy that should be a Hall of Famer, and Dave Brown, and Frank Clark had a really solid run in Seattle. This doesn't feel like one of those games that at the end of the day, Michigan's going to blow them out.
Yeah, West Virginia has a couple good solid players there, Geno and Bruce, and maybe they make they start out early, maybe it's 20-20 halfway through the first half, and then Michigan kind of inflicts their will eventually.
Yeah, that feels like the kind of matchup that we're talking about here. As far as what our listeners think, Michigan getting 70% of the vote. So Michigan is going to be moving on as well. We only had one upset in that round, according to our fans. So we're going chalk for the most part. When we come back, we're going to go over to the West region, the last 16 teams in our Alumni March Madness tournament. We'll get to that coming up next here on our Saturday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Locked On Seahawks is sponsored by BetterHelp. What's the first thing you'd do if you had an extra hour in your day? For me, I wish I had a bit more time for painting and creating artwork. The best way to squeeze that special thing into your schedule is to know what's important to you and make sure that it's a priority. Therapy can help you find what matters to you so you can do more of it. BetterHelp Online Therapy will assess your needs and can match you with your own licensed professional therapist in less than 48 hours. Therapy has worked wonders for me in the past, but don't just take my word for it. Having someone in your corner to guide you when you're struggling to navigate obstacles can be invaluable. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Learn to make more time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Get 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/lockedon. That's 10% off your first month of online therapy at betterhelp.com/lockedon. You're listening to the Saturday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined for today's show by my co-host, Nick Lee. And a special thanks to all the 12s out there. Thank you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. It is a jam-packed March Madness themed show. We've got Seahawks Alumni March Madness here as we have former and current players from 32 different schools battling for supremacy here. Let's go over now to the West region, the other 16 teams on our bracket. And Nick, we're going to start with the 1 seed against the 16. Again, this time it's number 1 seed Texas, led by Earl Thomas and Quandre Diggs. We could call them the Texas safeties looking at this list, going up against number 16 seed Mississippi State, led by KJ Wright.
Yeah, man, this is another, Purdue Grambling situation for me. Houston, whoever the heck they played the other night. Earl Thomas, Quandre Diggs, Quandre, I hope they can find a way to bring him back perhaps, but Earl Thomas should be, and I know he's had an unfortunate kind of run here off the field in the last few years, but certainly at least a Seahawks Hall of Famer, maybe pushed to be, Hall of Famer. But yeah, that's a pretty darn strong 1 seed. Maybe they're a number 1 overall seed, close. But what's not close is this game.
Yeah, it just feels like KJ Wright has literally no help here. I mean, Charles Cross could end up being a really good tackle in this league, and if we revisited this,
and he's in foul trouble after going to the Niners too.
Yeah, I think that this would certainly be an instance where Mississippi State down the road could be a higher seed, but right now they're clearly a 16, and poor KJ Wright right now just doesn't have any help. And our listeners agree, 92% for Texas on that one. Our next 8-9 seed to play against Texas, Virginia and Clemson. You've got Chris Warren, Patrick Kearney, Ray Roberts going up against Jeff Bryant, Byron Maxwell, Leroy Hill. This is actually maybe my most exciting round 1 matchup because I truly see this one as a toss-up. Ray Roberts himself on social media does not. He thinks Virginia dominates this one, but this is one that could go either way.
Yeah, I mean, 8-9 matchups, kind of a flip a coin kind of thing. I'm going to go with Virginia. Chris Warren definitely pulls the weight there. Those solid seasons in the early to mid 90s. I think it was 4 straight 1,000-yard seasons, 2 straight 1,300 rushing yards seasons. One of the more productive running backs in Seahawks history. So I'm going to go with Chris Warren's Virginia. Maybe he makes a huge play late in the game to turn the tide.
Our fans actually don't agree with your verdict there. I think Virginia's who I would go with on this one, but maybe they watched Virginia's basketball team the other day when they scored like 6 points in the first half.
You mean Iowa football?
Clemson got 65% of the vote on this one. So we've got a mild upset. Clemson, the 9 seed, is going on to play Texas in the next round. Moving on to the 5 seed against the 12, Virginia Tech against Penn State, led by Bam Bam himself, Cam Chancellor, Dwayne Brown on this list. Penn State, that's a pretty solid 12 seed with Kurt Warner, Bobby Engram, and in this case, Jordan Hill. I also would mention this Mike Robinson could have been a good addition to this one as well. So Penn State's got star power as the number 12 seed. Nick, this feels like one of those traditional 12-5 upsets that could be brewing.
This was probably my closest 5-12. Kurt Warner, again, another fantastic, productive running back, cut short, of course, by injuries and things like that. So maybe that could be a higher, maybe they're underseeded with what he could have been. This was probably the closest I would call a 12-5. You know what? I'm going to call it whatever. I know Cam Chancellor's there for Virginia Tech, and obviously should be a Seahawks Hall of Famer. I keep saying that at the top. Legion of Boom era, but the depth quite isn't there. But where for Penn State, they have a bit more of the the bench players or the role players, so to speak. So I can see Penn State making some noise here.
I'm going to go with Virginia Tech just because, Dwayne Brown was an all-pro at one point in a Seahawks uniform, and Cam Chancellor is one of the best players in franchise history. I think it's going to be close, but I'm going to go with the 5, and our listeners agree. They go 65% for Virginia Tech. Moving to our next matchup, number 4 seed Boston College against number 13 Ohio State. And we've got Jackson Smith and Jigba on there, even though he's only played one season. You've got Joey Galloway, Sean Springs, Matt Hasselbeck for Boston College, Joe Nash, and Pete Kendall, who was an underrated guard that played a long time elsewhere, but also had 4 really good seasons with the Seahawks.
Yeah, this will be fairly easy for me. You got a quarterback for the Seahawks who's made the Super Bowl. Joe Nash, I believe, was an all-pro. Let's see, in 1984. Yeah, he's an all-pro and Pro Bowler in 84 as a nose tackle. Had several solid seasons there. So, 16 sacks over 2 seasons in 84 and 85. They pull the weights. It's hard to go against a quarterback for the Seahawks who's actually made the Super Bowl.
I fully agree with you, and I think Joe Nash is one of the most criminally underrated Seahawks. I think he should be in the Ring of Honor. You're talking about one of the best quarterbacks in franchise history. This feels to me like a matchup that shouldn't be debatable. I feel like Boston College wins this one, and yet our listeners, this was the most stunning upset of this tournament so far. Our listeners picked Ohio State at a 71% clip on this with Joey Galloway and Sean Springs.
James Madison did.
Yeah, this is, I don't know that the 13 even won a game this year, but this is a 13-4 upset. Right. So Ohio State is going on to the next round. Up next, our 6-11 matchup, California against Tulsa. Now, Tulsa's got one of the biggest stars in Seahawks history in Steve Largent, but there's not much help there. Tulsa, not necessarily a football powerhouse, and California has got Marshawn Lynch, Brandon Mebane, and Justin Forsett. I feel like those first 2, Lynch and Mebane, that's enough star power right there, especially with the belly roll. I can't see Steve Largent getting past that by himself.
Steve, yeah, Tulsa here is like the A10 school with that scoring stud who might not make the NBA, but he's just draining. Golke maybe. California I think might be a little underseeded. I think that's a strong 6 seed. I could see making some noise. Marshawn Lynch, Brandon Mebane, not only just 2 solid football players, 2 fan favorites as well. Justin Forsett, don't sleep on that either. So depth wins here for Cal.
Yeah, I think the 2 big stars there. Mebane was one of the most underrated players in Seattle on their Super Bowl teams, a big part of that defensive line. They'd love to have a player like that eats up space right now. Had some sacks in his career. Marshawn Lynch is an icon, I think a future Hall of Famer. So this one feels like a 6-11 that isn't going to go in favor of the 11. Our listeners agree, 81.2% going with California. Going to the 3 seed against the 14 seed, Florida State against Utah State. Now, both teams have a Hall of Famer on the roster. Bobby Wagner is going to be a Hall of Famer, but this feels like Steve Largent's situation where Walter Jones has got a little more help than what Bobby Wagner does. Leon Washington was an all-pro kick returner. Michael Boulware was a safety on the Super Bowl team. Rick Booten-Tootin was a fantastic punter that made a Pro Bowl at one point. No offense to Robert Turbin, but this feels like this is way too lopsided of a matchup for Utah State to be able to get to round 2.
Yeah, Florida State here with Walter Jones at the top, Leon Washington, and all the way down to Tootin. Kind of feels like Kentucky, where they have a bunch of lottery picks, and then there's the top one, Walter Jones, while Utah State has like a Jimmer, like a sharpshooter guy, player of the year candidate. And then some of the role players aren't as solid, but there's that clear number 1 alpha guy. But of course, Florida State with just more playmakers, just more talent overall, those will win the day usually.
Our fans thought this was going to be a close matchup. In fact, Florida State had to eke this out at the end of voting. Utah State was ahead 2/3 of the way through voting, but Florida State ends up fending off Utah State in the final minutes, 58% of the votes. So Florida State survives, but they have a big battle because Bobby Wagner can shoulder a big load as a Hall of Fame linebacker. We're now going to the 7-10 matchup, and this one I think is intriguing. UCLA at number 7 Georgia at number 10. You've got a lot of really good players that weren't necessarily superstars here, like Chris Clemens. Max Strong, I think, is the best fullback easily in franchise history. Phillip Daniels had 4 good years in Seattle. On the other side, Norm Johnson was a great kicker for the Seahawks. Kenny Easley, a franchise icon. This really boils down to, is one star going to beat out 3 really solid players here in this 7-10 matchup?
And for me, the answer is yes. Kenny Easley, Hall of Famer again, kind of the, player of the year who has a little bit of talent around him from a power conference kind of thing. Georgia. And this one kind of reminds me of the team that has like not really a huge star, but they've all been around for 4 or 5 years. They're like 40 years old playing college basketball, one of those teams that tends to do well in March, but I think the overall talent will win out here for the 7 seed.
Yeah, I think this is one where having that superstar and Kenny Easley is going to help. And Twice Sopo was a good player as well that was kind of underrated, that was brought in by the Seahawks. And so I think that this is a matchup UCLA wins. I think it's a close one. Our fans lean towards UCLA, 62.9%. So the Bruins, the high seed, the 7 seed, they're moving on. Now, will they play the 2 seed Texas A&M, or are the Memphis Tigers feeling frisky with the pair of Keiths? We might as well call them the Memphis Keiths in this simulation. But Texas A&M, I'm not going to lie, this is a dangerous 2 seed with Jacob Green, Michael Bennett, Sam Adams, Red Bryant, Rocky Bernard. I'll say this, if it boiled down to size, Texas A&M is going to murder everybody in this tournament. This is a lot of beef and some really good defensive linemen for Texas A&M. Memphis has got the athletes, Keith Butler, Keith Simpson. This just feels like a matchup where there's just not enough help for the Keiths here.
Goodness, what fertilizer are they putting in the soil at Texas A&M for those defensive linemen? Like, goodness gracious. And that doesn't stop. They still churn out really solid defensive linemen, Myles Garrett and the like. This is a pretty fairly easy one for me. Texas A&M could have maybe they're sitting there in Selection Sunday ticked off. They're not a 1 seed because they're a really solid squad. That defensive line by itself could win some serious games on any field of sport whatsoever.
I think if Memphis was playing over in the other bracket as a 15 seed, that I might actually think there's a chance for a historic upset, but not in this case. Texas A&M, both in an alley and on a football field, I would take that Texas A&M roster to advance. So they'll play UCLA. Next week, we will move on to the round of 16. Who's going to the Elite 8? So this is going to continue next Friday as we continue to dive into the March Madness festivities. And we'll see which Seahawks roster with alumni from certain schools is going to end up coming out on top. As always, a special thanks to all the 12s out there for listening in. You can follow me on X and Threads at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Nick at Nick Lee 51. Check out Locked On Seahawks on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. Coming up on Monday, we got a new mock draft Monday. We're going to be diving into Nick's latest mock draft. Rob and I are going to be critiquing that latest mock draft. So it's going to be a really fun Monday show. Make sure that you're listening in. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. For those of you who love basketball, enjoy the rest of this first and second round of the NCAA tournament. Go Hawks.